Welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and if you are new to this podcast, Dead Sleep is like a true crime podcast with a touch of fabric softener. Gentler, softer, and a good value. Just pennies a capful. Because Dead Sleep is 100% listener-supported and ad-free. If you would like to ensure the success of this podcast, you can support the show with a monthly subscription via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Patreon. And as we settle in for the night, I wanted to share some really nice news. This podcast, Dead Sleep, has been nominated for a Clue Award in the category of Outstanding Episodic True Crime Podcast. Now, what is a Clue Award? Well, the Clue Awards are part of an annual event called CrimeCon. And CrimeCon, as you might deduce, is like Comic-Con for true crime people. And the Clue Awards recognize the best work in true crime storytelling across documentaries, nonfiction true crime books, as well as 2 categories for podcasts. And the Clue Awards, the dinner is happening in Denver, Colorado this coming Saturday. That's September 6th. And I'm pleased to say I am flying out later this week to attend the ceremony in Colorado. Now, Dead Sleep is a finalist, and we are in league with some pretty heavy hitters. But I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for listening and supporting this podcast for the past couple of years. Because somehow, through word of mouth, this podcast caught the attention of someone important at CrimeCon and the Clue Awards, and now here we are. And no matter what happens, it's going to be a lot of fun. Because here's the best part. The host of the Clue Awards this year is none other than Ice-T, a.k.a. Detective Tutela from Law & Order SVU. And yes, I am practicing my Law & Order TikTok dance, just in case there's a reason to celebrate. And now on to tonight's episode, which was also inspired in part by a TV show. One that I only recently really dove into, thanks to a recommendation from my friend Ryan. Thank you so much. It's HBO's Gilded Age. Now, in this podcast, we've told stories from Gilded Age writer icon Edith Wharton, along with some other real-life stories that took place during this era. But tonight's episode is unique because it is a real-life murder mystery that took place in Newport, Rhode Island in 1885. A story that I first stumbled upon thanks to an incredible, riveting feature by Kay Adams and Nancy Markey titled A Gilded Age Tale of Murder and Madness. And I will link to that story, along with a few other key sources in the show notes, and I highly recommend you give those stories a read. Now, of course, this is the Dead Sleep version of events, filled with detours and details to fatigue one's busy mind. And this is a story I'm calling Gilded Rage. Perseverance. That is what you had to have to make it in business, any business, especially if you want to achieve greatness. In the great Benjamin R. Burton, he was the epitome of perseverance. A hard-working man who started out as a teamster, using his team of horses to haul large amounts of coal that was back then used for fuel. Over the course of roughly 40 years, Ben Burton turned a pair of horses and a hauling business into a transportation empire. So much so that by 1885, nearly every single person in Newport, Rhode Island, relied on Mr. Ben Burton's fleet of wagons and omnibuses to get around town. And he pioneered the whole notion of mass transportation in Newport by creating essentially a horse-drawn bus, one that was available to anyone no matter where you lived in Newport, for the same flat fee. Ben was the model of the self-made man in the Gilded Age, where it wasn't your family ties to the Mayflower that mattered, but how much money you had in your bank account. And Ben Burton stood out not only as one of Newport's wealthiest and best-known entrepreneurs, he was also a prominent member of Newport, Rhode Island's Black elite. At 59 years old, Ben Burton was an elder statesman in Newport's growing population of upper-class, highly educated, and politically connected African Americans forging an ambitious new future for a truly unified United States, 20 years after the end of the Civil War. Benjamin Burton was from New England. He was born in Darien, Connecticut, and spent some of his youth in San Francisco, honing his business skills until he relocated to Newport, Rhode Island, just before Newport was being touted as a resort destination. And Ben, he'd invested wisely, purchasing properties and buildings all around the center of Newport. Over the many years he spent in Newport, the affable and generous Ben Burton was truly beloved by everyone in the entire town, from the old money New York socialites who vacationed there in the summer to the working-class locals who called Newport home year-round. Ben was strong, he was driven, and he embodied perseverance. Which is why what happened to him, what Ben Burton did, was such a shock. It was a rainy Tuesday morning, October 6th, 1885, just before 10 o'clock, when the sound of a faint pop broke through the everyday noises in this pleasantly busy neighborhood where Ben Burton lived, with his 2 grown daughters and his son-in-law. His mansion-like home was the biggest building on the entire block. That first pop was barely perceptible above the clopping sounds of horse hooves and rolling wheels of delivery wagons, and it was so faint, few people actually heard it. Then came the second pop. And with that second pop triggered a murmur of concern. That sounded like 2 shots from a gun. And concern quickly turned to confusion. Where did those 2 gunshots come from? Then the sound of a scream. As Ben Burton's daughter, 24-year-old Maria, flung open the door to their building and ran into the street, crying for help. It was her father, she yelled. He'd shot himself. Neighbors nearby rushed to the house, where Ben Burton's youngest daughter, Emmy, who was 18 years old, was inside, where she frantically announced, "Father killed himself. Go and get somebody." The anxious group followed her into the kitchen, where indeed Ben Burton lay under the breakfast table. Someone lifted his wrist, checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. It was impossible to believe. Ben Burton, legendary entrepreneur, the top-tier member of the Black elite, was dead? By suicide? Within minutes, local police and the medical examiner were on the scene. They hoisted Ben Burton's sizable frame, resting him on the kitchen table, inspecting his fatal wounds, where the medical examiner confirmed it was rare, but it was possible, that Ben Burton had shot himself twice. The evidence told a strange but plausible story. Without getting into too many graphic details, the medical examiner claimed that Ben Burton had tried to kill himself using a very small pistol aimed at his head first, and when that method failed, he quickly moved the pistol, pressed it up against his chest, and shot himself in the heart. Of course, that was just the initial determination by the medical examiner on the scene. Now, the medical examiner, he was a physician, but the ultimate determination of whether or not Ben Burton had indeed died by suicide or some other cause, that was up to the coroner, the elected official, who would go and do a series of interviews to find out what exactly had happened, which meant interviewing Ben Burton's two daughters, that's Maria and her younger sister Emmy, as well as Ben Burton's son-in-law, who at that point were huddled together in a room away from the kitchen, clearly upset and visibly shaken. They weren't sure what to say. Maria had discovered her father's body, but she'd been out running errands all morning. As for Emmy, she was in an entirely different part of the house. In this house, it was massive. She was somewhere, probably in an upstairs bedroom or an attic, where you couldn't hear a thing. As for Maria's husband, a medical student named Alan Dorsey, he wasn't much help either. He'd been sick, in bed, all morning, and he thought those two gunshots were the sounds of two slamming doors. They hadn't seen or heard anything or anyone else that day. But there was something that they did hear. Not that morning, but in the days and weeks before Ben Burton's apparent suicide. That on more than one occasion, their father had sat them down and told them quite clearly that he didn't expect to live much longer. They were aware he had health issues and he had a lot on his mind, but still, taking his own life like this, it was a shock. There was great sympathy for Burton's two daughters. They'd lost their mother 5 years earlier, and now here, this unwelcome tragedy. The Burtons were known as a loving, close-knit family, and they were clearly devastated. They couldn't believe it. But as police interviewed other friends of Ben Burton, they echoed something similar. Neighbors and colleagues, they felt terribly. Because recently, Ben Burton had made comments about how he was having money troubles and how he wanted to essentially escape. That he dreamed of floating away in the waves, crawling into a hole to die. And yes, he had said very clearly that he had the desire to blow his brains out. Why hadn't they listened? But at the time, people thought he was just getting stuff off his chest. They didn't think he'd really do it. Throughout his life, Ben had been through some incredibly hard times, and he always persevered. Even the death of his wife, he stepped up and raised his two children. And Maria, she'd just gotten married, and there would be grandchildren on the way. He had so much to live for. And now they were kicking themselves for not doing more. After speaking with Ben's family and doing a thorough autopsy, the coroner determined that Ben Burton had died from 2 self-inflicted gunshot wounds, and his death was ruled a suicide. And that was that. There was no need for any type of formal inquest. It was tragic, but true. Benjamin Burton had killed himself. And with that came a lesson that even if you think you know someone, you never really do you? There was only one thing left to do. Plan Ben Burton's funeral, which would be held October 10th, 1885, just 2 days after his death. And on that day, there wasn't a dry eye or an available seat at the local church where the services were held. And it seemed every single person in Newport, from the mayor to the milkman, was there to pay their respects and pray for Ben Burton's soul. And those who prayed for Ben's soul, they prayed out loud. But there were others who were whispering about what really happened to Benjamin Burton. As the church choir sang the hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," there were people who were far from convinced Ben Burton's death was a suicide. It didn't make any sense. They knew Ben to be an extroverted, amiable, quick-witted gentleman who seemed to have it all. And perhaps he had money problems, including some legal issues weighing on his mind. But that particular summer season was busier and more profitable than it had been in at least 2 years. Ben had talked about downsizing, maybe selling off his big property and moving into a small place with a lower mortgage, which meant maybe his life wasn't perfect, but he was figuring things out, making plans. And one of those people who refused to believe he died by suicide was his sister-in-law, Emily. Emily was the widow of Ben's late brother, and she also lived in the area. The day she learned Ben was dead, she rushed over and approached Newport police and inquired if it was possible, even probable, that her brother-in-law's death was, in fact, a murder. But if one were to follow Emily's suspicions, where would that lead? Ben didn't have any enemies. His death was written about in all of the local papers, and he was depicted as a beloved local leader and businessman. Now, Newport wasn't some utopia, but compared to other cities, Newport was the model of a successful, racially integrated city. But racism and classism did exist. And for years, as Ben struggled to build his business, he would come to work and discover someone had injured one of his horses or damaged one of his wagons. And yet, Ben's indomitable spirit never wavered. Maybe, even after all these years, with all of Ben's success, one of his previous competitors or someone with an old grudge stormed into Ben's house and killed him. But there were no witnesses, no sightings, and no sign of anyone entering or leaving the house that morning. So with no evidence of foul play, and Ben Burton's death legally ruled a suicide, it could have, should have, ended right there, with Ben deep in the ground and suspicions lurking just below the surface. Except the rumors about Ben being murdered persisted. And there was this one strange detail that both the medical examiner and the coroner overlooked, or rather, disregarded. But anyone who suspected that this was murder, it was a clue they couldn't ignore. The morning Ben was found, as he lay there on the floor, and neighbors rushed to his aid, they noticed Ben had something in his mouth, a white object that protruded ever so slightly from between his teeth. And that object was a hunk of bread. A big bite of a sweet roll, actually, and it was still in Ben's mouth, which seemed odd for a suicide. In what world does a person sit down for breakfast, take a big bite of bread, then stop mid-chew and shoot themselves, not once, but twice? Now, the medical examiner did note that piece of bread, but apparently it wasn't significant enough to overrule what was clearly, at least in his mind, a suicide. But those whispers, they grew louder. Within days after Ben's death and funeral, there were enough perturbing rumors and unanswered questions that word about the possibility of Ben Burton's death being a murder made its way to a plucky young lawyer named Patrick J. Galvin. Patrick was the son of Irish immigrants, and if the Catholic Patrick Galvin had a chosen saint, it would be St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Because Patrick specialized in representing society's most overlooked and underrepresented. And when he'd heard about what happened to Ben Burton, he became convinced there was more to this story, including the unlikelihood of 2 self-inflicted gunshots to one's head and chest. But even armed with his suspicions, this was a case nobody wanted to touch. This was Newport, and a suicide was bad enough, but a murder would bring unwanted attention and bad press to this resort town. And yet, the rumors kept spreading, and people kept pushing, until 10 days after Ben's burial, an exhumation was ordered, and another autopsy was performed, right there in the cemetery, at 1 o'clock in the morning, with handheld lanterns as the only source of light. But that light was bright enough to reveal some crucial information, and the most important was this. When they examined the right side of Ben's head, where he supposedly placed his gun and fired at close range, there was no evidence of gunpowder or any residue, which meant the gun had not been pressed to his head as previously believed. What's more, an examination inside Ben's skull revealed the small lead ball, shot from that old pistol, struck a part of Ben's brain that would have caused him to lose consciousness instantly. Even if he were still alive, it was impossible he could have maneuvered his hand to his heart and fired that second fatal shot. They'd gotten it wrong. Ben Burton was indeed murdered. But who did it and why? To find that out, they'd need a formal inquest, a proper murder investigation, where they'd have to take a fresh look at everyone in Ben Burton's life, starting with the people closest to him, starting with the person who found him in the kitchen, his eldest daughter, Maria. From the day she was born, it seems Ben and his wife thought of their daughter Maria as a queen. Her full name was Maria Antoinette, and in her own way she was royalty, as a member of the upper-class Burton family. Maria and her younger sister, 18-year-old Emmy, were often described as genteel, and they were sent to the best schools and admired for their poise and grace, as fine young ladies in society. Maria and Emmy were excellent reflections of their father, and excellent candidates for a proper marriage. Marriages amongst the elite in the Gilded Age, they weren't about love. They were about legacy, a way to rise above one's station within a single generation. If Maria married a gentleman from one of the prominent black families in Newport, think of what they could accomplish. Not just for their own future, but as an example for others, to have real impact, just like the wealthy white nouveau riche, like the Rockefellers or J.P. Morgan. But Maria, it seemed she had her heart set on Alan Dorsey. Now, Alan Dorsey, he didn't have the pedigree, but oh, he had potential. Alan's father was a barber, but Alan was in medical school and on track to become one of the first, if not the first, black surgeons in the country. Alan was hardworking, paying his way through school as a waiter during the summer months at a Newport restaurant. And it was in 1877 when he and Maria somehow crossed paths. And over the years, it seemed a romance bloomed. And at least from the outside, Alan would be the ideal son-in-law. A prominent doctor who was industrious and self-made. Ben would have most certainly approved. But there was one problem. Until Alan completed medical school and secured a position for himself, he didn't have much to offer financially. He was broke. But it seemed he loved Maria. And Ben, he found a way to ensure their happiness. So Ben and Alan, they had an arrangement. It was like a dowry, which was pretty common back then. Ben would give Alan money so he could finish up medical school in Pennsylvania, and he and Maria could get married, move down to Philadelphia, where he would be a successful surgeon, and they would begin a successful life together. And no doubt, forge an incredible future. So the couple, Maria and Alan, were married in June of 1885, and the plan was that they would stay there for the summer and then relocate down to Philadelphia so Alan could finish his medical degree. But as the Irish lawyer Patrick Galvin looked into that relationship, he made an unexpected discovery. The relationship between Alan and Ben, it had fallen apart. According to witness testimony, during a formal inquest, including Ben Burton's sister-in-law, Emily, Ben had quickly become frustrated with Alan Dorsey. Almost immediately after the wedding, Alan's behavior drastically changed. In Ben's view, gone was the industrious, hard-working future surgeon, and in his place was a man he didn't recognize. Throughout that summer, Alan refused to work. He had no plans to go back to any waitering job. And so he relaxed, stayed in bed, loafed around, and, at least in the eyes of Ben Burton, strutted around like a peacock, riding around in Ben Burton's carriage, freeloading off of his family, draining Ben Burton of his money. Ben became suspicious that Alan Dorsey was only after Maria's money, and so, in response, Ben withheld that dowry. And as days and months passed, and summer turned to fall, Alan got more desperate. He would have to pay for his medical school tuition in a matter of days. Ben remained steadfast in withholding the very money Alan so desperately wanted. And it was near the end of that summer where Alan and Maria were willing to do just about anything to get that money. Beg, borrow, even steal. According to Ben Burton's sister-in-law and other relatives, Maria had gone around asking family members if she could borrow some cash. And in one instance, a relative claimed that Maria had apparently stolen $200, roughly $5,000 in today's money. And apparently, Ben Burton had found out about Maria and Alan going around asking people to borrow money, and he was shocked and humiliated. When Ben confronted Maria, she denied borrowing or stealing any money. But her father wasn't convinced. He was enraged. He decided right then and there that he wanted Maria and Alan out of his house. Instead, soon after that argument, Ben Burton was found, shot dead in his kitchen. And Alan Dorsey was the perpetrator. He had to be. Of course, this was just one version of events. They had yet to have clear evidence that Ben Burton had been murdered by Alan Dorsey and that Maria had any role in that murder. But over a 4-day-long inquest with over 60 witnesses, ultimately it was determined there was enough evidence to arrest both Alan Dorsey and Maria in the murder of Ben Burton. Alan Dorsey's arrest happened November 19th of 1885, and soon after, youngest daughter Emmy was sent off to live with her aunt. Maria and Alan swore they were innocent, and even those who suspected they might be guilty began to question whether or not it was true. Because those who were on the side of Alan Dorsey and swore he was innocent included some of the most prominent members of the Black elite, including African-American activist and abolitionist George T. Downing. George T. Downing knew Ben Burton because the two both had businesses in Newport. Downing was a well-known restaurateur, and he could say from personal experience that he knew Ben Burton had a gambling problem, that he had financial problems, and that he had heard him say on more than one occasion that he wished he were dead. And from his perspective, Alan Dorsey was being railroaded. Here was a prominent future physician, the first Black surgeon in the United States. In his whole life, his whole future was being threatened by this ridiculous rumor. This couple should be allowed to move forward with their lives. Further complicating matters, Maria was pregnant. All of Newport was divided, and that division crossed all race and class lines. There were people who passionately believed that Ben Burton had been murdered and Maria and Alan did it. And there were others who believed Ben Burton had taken his own life and poor Alan and Maria were being railroaded. And it was possible, if the jury felt the same way, this trial could end as a hung jury, a mistrial. No, that is until someone decided to make a surprise confession. And that confession didn't come from Maria or Alan. The confession came from teenage sister Emmy. 4 days after Alan Dorsey's arrest, Emmy summoned lawyer Patrick Galvin and the coroner. And so Patrick and the coroner went to where Emmy was staying at her aunt's house, and they were shocked to see her condition. She was severely ill, some problem with her lungs, and she was fearful that she was going to die. And she would die harboring this horrible secret. She felt compelled to tell the truth about what really happened with her father. And so she made her confession. And she was one part of a terrible plan, an accomplice in the murder of her own father. A plan that was plotted by Alan Dorsey. Emmy had spent a lot of time with Alan and Maria, and the three had grown very close. And it was through that relationship that Alan was able to persuade Emmy to help them carry off the murder of her father. And there was some logic to it. Her father had been saying that he was going to die. He had talked about his ill health, and he had, in the past, threatened self-harm. And the fact was, Ben Burton had withheld money from Alan Dorsey and Maria, and without that money, Alan was doomed. His future was over. He was as good as dead. And somehow through all of this conversation, she was persuaded to be the lookout. And what happened that morning, it went something like this. Alan was fed up with being withheld the money, and frustrated, he decided that today was the day that Ben Burton was going to die. He and Maria had apparently discussed it many times, but this was it. And so Maria left the house, and Alan asked Emmy to be his lookout, make sure no one came into the house while this was all going down. Alan tiptoed into the kitchen where Ben Burton was enjoying his sweet roll. Without any warning, as a complete surprise, Alan shot Ben on the side of his head. And much to his horror, Ben wasn't dead. He was on the floor, still alive. So Alan, panicking, shot him again, this time in the chest. And it was soon after that Maria came in, and she was equally horrified of what had happened, what she'd done. And soon the police were there, the medical examiner was there, the coroner had ruled this a suicide, and it seemed that they were going to get away with it. But Emmy, she couldn't take the guilt. It was eating at her, and she was convinced her guilt had made her sick. News of Emmy's confession shocked Patrick Galvin. He wasn't surprised she knew about the murder, but he had no idea that she had been there and played a role in it as an accomplice. The trial against Maria and Alan moved forward. Now, with Emmy and her signed confession, brutal proof of what they had done. But the trial continued, day after day after day. And soon, Maria had her baby, a little boy. And although she was incarcerated, she was allowed to hold her baby in court, where she and Alan doted on the little child. And the pair seemed supremely confident that they would get an acquittal, despite Emmy's testimony. Maybe it was Maria seeing her sickly sister. Maybe it was the fact that she'd had a baby boy. Maybe hearing all of those intricate details of her own father's injuries finally got to her conscience. But she too made her confession. Though she swore she wasn't aware Alan was going to shoot her father that day, and that she was afraid of Alan, that their marriage had deteriorated before it had even started. And she believed Alan was really only after her money. And sadly, she realized their marriage was probably headed for divorce. Desperate to keep the marriage together, Maria mentioned that her father had a life insurance policy. She wasn't exactly sure of the details, but she remembered years ago when her mother was still alive, they talked about it. And maybe that was a desperate gesture to get Alan to still love her and to stay. Whatever the case, after the murder, when Ben Burton was dead, they opened the safe, found the insurance policy, and discovered that policy had lapsed years ago. There was no great fortune. All of this had been essentially for nothing. Now, Maria had confessed all of this to her pastor, and her pastor reminded her that it was still early in the trial. It was possible that she could get an acquittal. She believed the only way to atone for what she had done, for the murder of her kind and generous father, her only relief would be punishment, a life sentence in prison, which she got. Emmy did too. They were both sentenced to life in prison, though neither one would live that long. Emmy, the younger sister, died from this long illness 4 months into her prison sentence. Maria also fell ill while in prison. She developed consumption and suffered a long illness before finally succumbing to the disease. But just before she died, her husband, Alan, requested to see her. And after giving her a perfunctory kiss, said he needed a favor. In essence, he told Maria he would really appreciate it if she would take the blame for this murder. She was dying after all. And if she could just say it was her responsibility, her fault, that she'd done it, Alan could go free, and he could live the life that he'd always dreamed of. But Maria said no. Maria would spend 2 more years in prison, ultimately dying from consumption. But Maria, she didn't care. Her baby had been taken from her when she was convicted of murder. And when she discovered that the baby had been adopted by a family and moved to New York City and would live under a whole different name and a whole different identity, she said death couldn't come soon enough. As for Alan, he was sentenced to life in prison, and after serving 25 years, he was released in 1912. He moved to New York City, though there would be no promising career for him waiting in the wings. Just a job, waiting tables, which he did until he died in 1918 at the age of 60. As for Alan and Maria's baby, his name was changed to Ernest Young. And despite the tragedy that surrounded him when he was born, Ernest Young would go on to survive and thrive. Because whether he knew it or not, he was the grandson of Benjamin Burton. Perseverance was in his blood. Thank you again for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, and as always, there's so much more to the story that I couldn't fit into the episode, and I encourage you to read Kay Adams and Nancy Markey's much richer, fascinating account called A Gilded Age Tale of Murder and Madness, which I will link to in the show notes. I think you'll really enjoy it. And with that, I'm off to Colorado, with fingers crossed and eyes closed. Nighty-night.